Do you remember the recipes only Black grandmas could make? They were slow-cooked lessons in love and survival. What happens when the hands that kept them alive are gone? Collard greens with smoked ham hocks were more than food. They were the heartbeat of Sunday dinners. The greens simmered for hours, softening slowly as the smoky richness of the ham hocks soaked into every leaf. The smell alone could fill a whole house and call everyone to the table before the pot was even ready. Black grandmothers knew just how to season it, never by measure, only by instinct. A pinch of salt here, a touch of pepper there, maybe a splash of vinegar at the end to wake up the flavor. The broth, or potlikker, was gold, sopped up with cornbread and shared like a blessing. In those kitchens, patience was the main ingredient. Collard greens weren't just greens. They were love made visible, a slow-cooked promise that nobody in that house would ever go hungry. The tenderness came not just from time on the stove, but from time spent together. Sweet potato pie was a masterpiece that no store-bought dessert could touch. The sweet potatoes were boiled, mashed, and blended with butter, sugar, eggs, and warm spices that seemed to belong only to Grandma's hands. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and a whisper of vanilla turned the filling into velvet. When baked, the top browned just enough to crackle, while the inside stayed smooth and rich. Every Thanksgiving table waited for that first slice, the one that tasted like memory. No measuring cups were needed, just years of knowing by sight and feel. It wasn't just dessert, it was pride baked into a crust. Each pie carried a story of resilience, family, and joy that had survived generations. Sweet potato pie wasn't made to impress, it was made to remember, and to remind everyone that love, when baked slow and shared warm, never fades. Fried catfish with cornmeal crust was the taste of Friday nights when payday met patience. Cleaned and seasoned with salt, pepper, and a grandmother's wisdom, the catfish was dredged in cornmeal and dropped gently into a pan of hot oil. The sizzle said it all, golden crust forming, flesh tender beneath. No recipe was written. Each family had its way. Some added paprika, others a little mustard. All made sure the fish was fried just right. Crispy edges, flaky center. Served with hush puppies or white bread, maybe a drizzle of hot sauce, it was joy you could hold in your hands. Black grandmothers turned this humble catch into a feast, feeding family, neighbors, and anyone who stopped by. Each bite was a reminder that simplicity, when done with care, could taste like abundance. Fried catfish was proof that mastery didn't come from money. It came from heart. The frying pan was like a stage, and Grandma was the conductor, listening to the rhythm of the oil, watching the color of the crust, knowing exactly when to lift each piece. A paper towel-lined plate sat ready to catch the fresh batch, steaming and golden, ready to disappear. The first taste was always the best, hot, seasoned, alive with memory. Okra gumbo was a stew that told an entire history in one pot. It started with a roux. Flour and oil stirred low and slow until it turned deep brown, like roasted nuts. Then came the okra, tomatoes, onions, and sometimes sausage or shrimp, depending on what the day offered. The pot thickened as it simmered, rich with flavor and memory. Black grandmothers stood over it with wooden spoons, never rushing, knowing that gumbo was as much about patience as it was about spice. Served over rice, every bowl felt like home. Each region had its version, each family its secret. Gumbo carried Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South together, all in one dish. It wasn't just food, it was heritage, preserved through hands that remembered more than words ever could. Some grandmothers swore by a little file powder, others said the secret was in the stir. But all agreed, you had to cook it with care, never anger. The smell alone brought people running because gumbo meant company. You could taste the generations in it, the stories, the laughter, and the love that survived every hardship. Salmon croquettes were the breakfast of ingenuity, born from tin cans and imagination. Canned salmon was mixed with onions, cornmeal, and a bit of egg shaped into patties and fried until crisp. The smell filled the house like a promise that the day would be all right. They were crunchy on the outside, tender inside, and full of flavor that reached far beyond their humble ingredients. The sizzle of the skillet was music, the sound of a meal stretching to feed everyone. Eaten with grits, biscuits, or a little mustard on the side, they turned a simple morning into something memorable. These croquettes were survival disguised as comfort food, proof that scarcity never stopped creativity. They were hearty enough for men heading to work and tasty enough to make children smile. The golden crust caught the light just right, shining like victory in the pan. Salmon croquettes were a triumph of spirit and taste over circumstance. Smothered pork chops were the kind of meal that made the whole house quiet, except for the sound of gravy bubbling on the stove. You could smell it before you saw it. Thick onion gravy wrapping around fried pork until every bite turned tender and soft. It was never rushed, never careless, always cooked slow enough for the flavor to find its way inside. Families saved their best pan for it, the one that had seen birthdays and Sunday dinners and still held the shine of memory. There was pride in turning a cheap cut of meat into something that felt rich, even if you had almost nothing to work with. Children would sit nearby, waiting for that first plate, watching the steam rise like a promise. The cook never hurried, stirring slow, letting the onions melt into the gravy until it smelled like comfort itself. It wasn't fancy, but it felt sacred, a meal built from patience, love, and trust in what you had. Smothered pork chops weren't just food, they were proof that love could season anything, and patience could feed a family when money could not. Cornbread-topped chicken pot pie turned leftovers into gold. Instead of pastry crust, thrifty cooks poured cornbread batter over creamy chicken and vegetables, letting it bake until puffed and golden. The result was a perfect blend of soft filling and slightly sweet crust, hearty enough to stand alone. Every bite had the comfort of home, warm gravy, tender chicken, and buttery corn flavor melting together. The scent was pure nostalgia, that cozy mix of baked corn and simmered stock. This was a dish built on resilience, the kind that made the most of what was already there. It stretched a small bird across a family, leaving everyone full and grateful. Cornbread-topped chicken pot pie was food made with intention, proof that comfort didn't need excess. It needed heart. You could taste love in every layer, from the browned edges to the tender crumbs soaking up the sauce below. Caramel cake was once the centerpiece of Sunday dinners, a dessert that showed love, patience, and skill in every slice. The cake itself was soft and tender, but it was the icing that made it unforgettable. Homemade caramel frosting required time and attention, stirring sugar and butter until it transformed into a golden, rich glaze. African-American families across the South often saved caramel cake for special occasions where it graced the table as a symbol of celebration. It was not a quick dessert, but one that demanded practice, steady hands, and a willingness to stand over the stove until the caramel reached perfection. The flavor was sweet, with a depth that no boxed mix could imitate, and the texture melted on the tongue with every bite. Children often begged for the first slice, and grandmothers proudly served it to guests as proof of their kitchen mastery. Over time, easier frostings and store-bought cakes took its place, but the memory of caramel cake still lingers for those who grew up with it. It was more than just dessert, it was a statement of love baked into every layer. Cornbread and beans was the supper of survivors, the backbone of countless working families who knew how to turn little into plenty. The beans simmered low and slow, soaking up every bit of flavor from scraps of onion, bacon, or a precious ham bone saved from Sunday dinner. The longer they cooked, the richer they became, filling the home with a deep, savory scent that promised satisfaction. Cornbread baked nearby, its golden crust rising in the oven, the smell of butter and cornmeal mixing perfectly with the aroma of beans on the stove. When dinner was ready, families gathered close, crumbling the cornbread right into their bowls to soak up the thick broth. It wasn't just filling, it was fulfilling, warming both the body and the spirit. Some families added vinegar, others sprinkled sugar, but every household had its way of making it just right. Cornbread and beans told a story of endurance and community, of hard hands and full hearts. It wasn't luxury, it was life, steady and sustaining, passed from one generation to the next as a lesson in gratitude and grace. It reminded everyone that love, like good beans, only grows stronger the longer it's tended. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that blended creativity with thrift, transforming greens into the centerpiece of a meal. My grandmother cooked the greens down with onion and broth until tender, then poured them into a dish and covered them with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, soaking in the juices of the greens below. It looked like a Sunday supper, even though it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families sliced into the pot pie and found warmth, substance, and a reminder that greens were not just a side dish, but a main course. Paired with cornbread or beans, it became a meal that stretched across households. In the 1960s, this kind of resourcefulness kept families going, proving that with care and imagination, even simple greens could feel special. Turnip green pot pie was proof that hard times did not mean giving up pride at the table. Coffee and condensed milk was the quiet start to countless mornings across generations. Before creamers, sugar packets, or modern machines, people reached for the same trusted can of condensed milk. It was thick, heavy, and sweet enough to turn even the strongest brew into something smooth and soothing. The first pour made a soft hiss, the kind that filled kitchens with calm before the day's noise began. It was more than just coffee. It was company, ritual, and comfort wrapped in steam. Men sipped it before long days in fields and factories. Women drank it while feeding children or ironing clothes. The milk stretched far, lasting through weeks of careful use, every drop measured with love and thrift. It tasted familiar, steady, and kind, the same way mornings always began. The smell lingered in the air long after the last sip, a sign the day had officially started. For many, it was their first sweetness, their first warmth, their first reminder that even simple things could feel abundant. Coffee and condensed milk was not fancy, but it was faithful, the flavor of home that stayed the same no matter where life went. Candied yams were the kind of sweet that made the kitchen feel like a celebration even on a weekday. Slices of orange yams baked in butter, sugar, and cinnamon until they glistened like amber in the pan. The smell alone could draw neighbors in from the porch. It was sticky, soft, and golden, something you did not rush or measure too carefully. It reminded people of holidays, even when there was no turkey or feast. Every spoonful was joy, simple and honest. You could taste the sweetness of survival, the warmth of love baked into every layer. Kids licked the spoons while mothers checked the oven, waiting for that caramelized crust to bubble just right. Candied yams carried a magic that turned any meal into a memory. Candied yams made ordinary days taste special, and that was their magic. They turned struggle into sweetness every single time. Cabbage and corned beef hash was the pantry's promise kept. Canned corned beef sizzled in cast iron, melting into onions and potatoes until crispy at the edges. Shredded cabbage followed, softening in the fat and salt until every bite turned rich and smoky. It was a one-pan wonder, hearty enough to stand alone, humble enough to belong anywhere. For families on tight budgets, it was comfort that did not ask for apology. The kitchen filled with a scent that felt both savory and safe. Served with biscuits or rice, it fed many and left none hungry. It was proof that flavor could bloom even from a can, that dignity lived in every meal made with heart. The potatoes browned just enough to crunch, while the cabbage melted into sweetness. It was food that reminded people that love does not always wear a feast. It sometimes comes in the quiet sound of a skillet and a full belly. Peach ice cream made by hand was a summer joy, created outdoors with hand-crank freezers packed with ice and salt. African-American families gathered on porches or yards, taking turns turning the handle as the mixture churned slowly into frozen cream. Fresh peaches, peeled and mashed, were stirred into the custard base, giving the dessert its bright sweetness. The process took time and teamwork, but that was part of its magic. Children waited eagerly for the first scoop, often licking the paddles clean once the freezer was opened. The flavor was unmatched, fresher and richer than anything from a store. It was also an event, more than just dessert, since making it brought everyone together in laughter and effort. Peach ice cream was served at reunions, picnics, and summer holidays, where it cooled hot afternoons and created lasting memories. Today, machines and pre-made cartons have replaced the ritual, but they cannot replace the feeling. Hand-churned peach ice cream was more than food. It was family and tradition, spun into sweetness. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and tomato sauce were the pride of thrifty kitchens. Mothers would line up bright green peppers on the counter, slicing off the tops and scooping out the seeds with care. A single pound of ground meat, beef if you were lucky, or whatever was on sale, was stretched with rice, onions, and breadcrumbs until it could feed the whole family. The mixture was packed into each pepper, standing tall in a baking dish before being smothered in tomato sauce. As it baked, the scent filled the house with warmth, tangy and savory all at once. The peppers softened, the sauce thickened, and dinner became something that looked fancy even when it cost next to nothing. Families gathered around the table, cutting through the soft vegetables to reveal the hearty filling inside. It was a meal that brought pride, not pity, proof that resourcefulness could taste like celebration. Every bite carried the balance of thrift and love, where nothing went to waste and everything felt like home. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Cold biscuits with syrup or jelly were a working morning's salvation. When there was no time to bake or fry, yesterday's biscuits came to the rescue. Split open and drizzled with cane syrup or spread with homemade jelly, they softened into something sweet and tender. The flavor was simple but full of comfort. These were the breakfasts eaten standing by the door, one hand holding the biscuit, the other ready for work. Children loved the sticky sweetness. Adults appreciated the speed. It was proof that not every meal had to be warm to be good. In homes where nothing was wasted, even cold bread found new life with just a spoon of sweetness. The habit became tradition, a quick bite that still felt like love. Stewed chicken with dumplings was the kind of meal that gathered everyone close. The chicken, simple and seasoned, boiled gently until it gave all its flavor to the broth. Dumplings, cut by hand from scraps of dough, floated on top like little clouds soaking in every drop of goodness. It was thick, rich, and warm enough to chase away any cold day. This was the kind of food made in one pot, where the smell alone was enough to make children set the table without being told. Each bite carried comfort and care, a reminder that love was often found in the simplest meals. The broth would bubble slow, carrying the scent of herbs, flour, and memory all at once. It was food for healing, for comfort, for hope when times were thin. Stewed chicken and dumplings were proof that good food didn't come from plenty. It came from patience, skill, and heart. Smothered rabbit and gravy was the kind of dish that spoke of countryside living, of early mornings and quiet prayers before supper. Rabbits were not store-bought meat. They were caught or traded, dressed by hand, seasoned by instinct. The meat browned in iron skillets, searing until the edges crackled, then bathed in gravy thickened from drippings and flour. The smell alone could pull a family to the table before grace was said. The gravy soaked into rice or mashed potatoes, blending with the tender meat into something both wild and homebound. It was more than food. It was a skill, an art passed down by those who knew how to make something grand from what the earth offered. For those who grew up on smothered rabbit, it was a taste of legacy, not luxury. Every forkful carried the rhythm of survival and the softness of care. It was slow, steady cooking, the kind that taught patience, gratitude, and love in every stirring of the pot. Banana pudding with meringue was once a favorite at family gatherings, layered with homemade custard, vanilla wafers, and sliced bananas, then crowned with fluffy meringue. African-American cooks elevated this dish by topping it with browned meringue rather than whipped cream, which gave it elegance without added expense. The custard was cooked slowly on the stove, thickened with eggs and milk until silky, then poured over layers of cookies and fruit. The meringue was whipped by hand until stiff, spread across the top, and baked just long enough to turn golden. Families valued it because it made a modest amount of bananas feed a crowd while still tasting indulgent. It was often served at church dinners, where its airy topping drew eyes before the first spoonful was taken. The pudding was sweet, creamy, and soft, with the crunch of cookies softened into the mix. Today, instant mixes have replaced the homemade versions, but they lack the patience and pride of the original. Banana pudding with meringue was once a centerpiece of gatherings, treasured for its taste and presentation. Homemade fish cakes were the ocean's gift to frugal kitchens and clever cooks. Canned salmon, mackerel, or even tuna became something special when mixed with breadcrumbs, minced onion, and egg. The mixture was formed into patties, pressed firm between flour-dusted palms, and dropped into hot oil where they hissed and crackled. The smell filled the kitchen with a salty promise, the kind that made you feel rich no matter what the bank said. Each patty fried to a perfect golden brown, crisp on the edges and soft inside. Served with a squeeze of lemon or a side of potatoes, they were a complete meal, cheap, filling, and full of pride. The secret was in the seasoning, often passed down from memory. A pinch of salt, a touch of mustard, maybe a shake of pepper. They were proof that good food came from care, not cost. Every bite was a reminder that a clever cook could make the simplest pantry taste like a banquet. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs was another way families stretched cheap vegetables into full meals. Turnips were easy to grow and often given away, their strong flavor softened by boiling them until tender. My grandmother ladled the hot turnips into bowls and topped them with crumbled cornbread, the bread soaking up the broth until it became hearty enough for supper. It was plain food, yes, but it kept stomachs full on nights when meat was scarce. The bitterness of the turnips mellowed with time and seasoning, and the cornbread gave every bite body and comfort. Children might have grumbled, but they ate their fill because there was no room for waste. In the 1960s, this dish was common across kitchens that relied on ingenuity to make ends meet. It was a simple combination, yet it carried dignity because it represented survival. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs may not have been fancy, but it held families together through lean times. Fried salt pork with red-eye gravy was breakfast for people who worked from dawn till dark. Thin slices of salted pork hit the skillet and popped in hot grease, sending out the smell that could wake an entire house. The drippings were stirred with leftover coffee, creating a thin, dark gravy with a sharp bite. It poured over grits, biscuits, or potatoes, transforming plain food into something bold. It was salty, smoky, and slightly bitter, the kind of flavor that stayed with you. This was not delicate food, it was survival food, strong and unapologetic. It came from farm kitchens, from mothers who cooked before the sun rose. The coffee gave it depth, the pork gave it strength. Together, they made a meal that carried you through the hardest labor. You could taste history in every spoonful, the struggle, the endurance, the art of turning scraps into sustenance. Red-eye gravy was not pretty, but it was powerful. It said, "We may not have much, but we will eat well anyway." Stewed tomatoes and rice were a Depression-era miracle, born from necessity but remembered for comfort. Tomatoes stewed down until soft and tangy, mixed with rice that soaked up every drop of flavor. Sometimes a little sugar was added to balance the bite, sometimes onions or bell peppers joined in for depth. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. It filled the belly, warmed the heart, and reminded people that simple could still mean special. For many, it was dinner after long days in the field or factory when money was tight but pride was strong. The steam rising from the pot carried both memory and gratitude. Even when meat was scarce, stewed tomatoes and rice made sure no one went to bed hungry. It was the taste of care and perseverance wrapped in one humble bowl. Potato and onion gravy over biscuits was survival turned comfort. When meat was scarce, Grandma fried onions in butter until golden, whisking in flour and water to make a thick, creamy sauce. Potatoes followed, diced small, cooked until soft, absorbing every ounce of flavor. The gravy poured rich and heavy over biscuits, steaming and soft. It was simple, hearty, and full of the kind of satisfaction money could not buy. The onions caramelized to sweetness, the potatoes gave body, and the biscuits caught every drop. For many families, this was dinner, the kind that filled bellies and lifted spirits without apology. No one complained about what was missing. They celebrated what was there. The meal carried humility, but it also carried hope, proof that comfort could come from the humblest of hands. The kitchen smelled of toasted flour and warmth, and the first bite silenced every worry in the room. It was food that restored, reminding everyone that enough was sometimes more than plenty. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a southern staple that seemed to appear on tables no matter how hard times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and dried well enough to last through seasons, making them a dependable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother simmered them slowly with onion, maybe a scrap of pork if any was left, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Cornbread was baked alongside, crumbly and warm, and served as the perfect companion, soaking up every bit of broth. Together they made a full meal, packed with enough substance to keep workers fed after long days in the fields or factories. Field peas were humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, but they carried a taste of the land, earthy and comforting. For families with little money to spare, this pairing was dependable, stretching across generations as a dish of both necessity and pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread filled stomachs, warmed hearts, and reminded everyone that simple food could still be good food. Hot cakes from scratch were the kind of breakfast that filled both plate and spirit. Made with buttermilk, flour, and a spoon of bacon grease, they sizzled on iron skillets until golden brown. The edges turned crisp, while the centers stayed soft and airy. These pancakes carried the smell of warmth, salt, and home. Syrup was a treat, but butter or molasses worked just as well. Children would line up with plates in hand, waiting for the next stack. Every flip of the spatula felt like love served hot. They were meals made from what was on hand, never fancy, always right. The bacon grease gave them flavor that stayed with you long after breakfast ended. Families gathered close, laughter mixing with the sound of frying batter. Hot cakes from scratch were not about abundance. They were about comfort built from what you had, made perfect with care. Turkey wing pot roast turned thrift into triumph, stretching a few wings into a meal that could feed many. Grandma browned them first, the skin crisping under the heat before she laid them into the pan with carrots, onions, and potatoes. A little water, a pinch of spice, and time did the rest. Hours later, the kitchen smelled like heaven, rich, savory, and full of promise. The meat fell from the bone with the gentlest touch, the gravy glistening across the vegetables. It was not expensive, but it was everything a meal should be, filling, flavorful, and full of care. Families gathered, hungry and happy, their plates warm and their spirits lifted. Turkey wing pot roast was proof that even the least celebrated parts could shine when cooked with love. It was patience turned into flavor, comfort baked into tradition, and every bite whispered that nothing made by hand was ever humble. Hush puppies were the golden sidekick of every fish fry. Fried cornmeal batter balls, crisp on the outside and soft within. Made from cornmeal, onion, and buttermilk, they were dropped by spoonfuls into bubbling oil, sizzling like applause. The smell alone drew neighbors to the porch, Served hot and fresh, they were eaten by the handful, sometimes dipped in sauce, sometimes plain, always perfect. Grandmothers made them by feel, adding a splash of milk or a pinch of sugar until the batter looked right. They paired with fried catfish, shrimp, or anything cooked outdoors. Hush puppies weren't just food, they were fellowship, laughter, and sunshine rolled into a bite. They carried the flavor of gatherings, of music, and of the simple joy of being together. Pine needle tea offered a bright and restorative drink when fresh produce was scarce during cold months. Enslaved foragers collected the youngest green needles from longleaf and loblolly pines, rinsed them carefully, and steeped them in hot water until the brew released a light citrus aroma. Rich in vitamin C, this tea helped ward off scurvy and brought a welcome freshness to winter diets heavy with salt-preserved foods. The practice echoed both indigenous traditions and West African herbal knowledge, merging two continents' wisdom into a single sustaining cup. Families continued to brew pine needle tea well after emancipation, and it remains popular among modern herbalists for its gentle flavor and reputed immune-boosting qualities. Its evergreen scent and warm golden color remind us that even in the most barren season, the forest offered nourishment. Pine needle tea illustrates how observing the land and respecting its cycles allowed people to find both medicine and comfort, turning what others overlooked into a sustaining daily ritual that strengthened body and spirit alike. Stewed oxtails with rice gravy brought deep flavor and slow-cooked richness to Sunday tables across many African American communities. Oxtails, once inexpensive and overlooked, were browned in heavy pots and then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until the meat turned buttery soft. The braising liquid thickened into a silky gravy that clung to each grain of rice, creating a dish that was equal parts comfort and celebration. Families saved this meal for weekends when everyone could gather because patience was essential and conversation flowed while the pot worked its magic. Children sneaked tastes from wooden spoons, drawn by the savory aroma that filled the house from morning until evening. The humble tale, once discarded by butchers, became a centerpiece of pride and ingenuity. Today, rising prices and faster cooking habits mean fewer people take the time to coax such tenderness from a simple cut of beef, but those who remember the meal speak of it as a perfect union of thrift, skill, and the slow rhythm of family life. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic that fit the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Stewed okra and corn was summer's promise kept alive in a bowl. Bright yellow kernels and tender green okra met in a bubbling pan with a touch of butter and black pepper. It didn't look fancy, but one bite told you everything about family gardens, hot days, and cool kitchens. Grandparents knew how to make this taste like something special without spending a dime. It was one of those dishes that balanced sweetness and earthiness perfectly, the corn melting into the okra softening just enough to hold it together. It went with everything, from fried fish to biscuits, but it could also stand alone when the pantry ran thin. Kids who grew up on it remember the crackle of the pan and the smell that meant dinner was near. It's a dish that lives in the quiet corners of memory, humble and honest. Wild rice pudding combined indigenous grains with African-inspired preparation to create a dish both nourishing and subtly sweet. Wild rice grew naturally in shallow lakes and slow rivers, and enslaved families near these wetlands harvested the dark grains with paddles and baskets, drying them in the sun for year-round use. Cooked slowly in water until tender, the rice was stirred with a bit of sorghum syrup or honey if available, making a warm pudding that supplied protein and lasting energy. Its nutty flavor and satisfying texture turned a simple bowl into a special treat, especially when fresh fruit or spices could be added. This recipe carried forward after emancipation as African-American cooks continued to value wild rice for festive meals and family gatherings. Modern chefs still celebrate its earthy richness, but the story behind wild rice pudding honors the blend of native and African foodways that sustained people through scarcity and created a dessert that is at once humble and deeply rooted in the shared history of America's wetlands and kitchens. Sweet potato pie with brown sugar meringue crowned holiday tables with a beauty that matched its flavor. Smooth, mashed sweet potatoes blended with warm spices created a filling as rich as any custard, poured into a flaky handmade crust. The crowning touch was a cloud of meringue whipped with brown sugar until caramel-scented peaks formed and browned lightly in the oven. Families saved the first slice for honored guests or elders, a sign of respect and affection. The pie carried the sweetness of the southern soil and the skill of generations who knew how to stretch simple ingredients into celebration. Children licked the mixing bowls clean while parents watched the meringue rise, a shared moment of anticipation before the feast. Over time, commercial pies and instant mixes dulled the tradition, but those who remember the warm aroma of brown sugar meringue know that this dessert is more than food. It is a memory of family love, patient hands, and the quiet pride of homemade beauty. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Okra and tomatoes stew was the kind of dish that stretched a garden into a meal. The pot came alive with color, bright reds and deep greens bubbling together, thickened just enough to cling to rice or cornbread. Okra was the backbone, its silky texture giving body to every spoonful, while tomatoes brought the tang that tied everything together. Grandparents made it in the summer when gardens overflowed and nothing went to waste. If you had a little onion, a pinch of salt, and patience, you could feed everyone. The smell drifted through the house, a mix of earthiness and spice that promised something hearty on the table. It wasn't just about taste, it was about gratitude, about pulling something beautiful out of the soil and turning it into sustenance. In lean times, this stew could hold a family steady. Some added smoked sausage when they had it, others kept it purely from the garden. But the feeling it gave was always the same: full, content, cared for. It's a dish that proves comfort doesn't need money, just memory. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. Homemade Cracklin bread filled kitchens with the savory perfume of pork fat and toasted cornmeal. Families saved every scrap of rendered pork skin, frying it until crisp and then folding the cracklings into cornbread batter rich with buttermilk and a touch of lard. Baked in a well-seasoned skillet, the bread emerged with a crisp crust and pockets of salty crunch that delighted children and elders alike. It was a dish born of necessity, ensuring nothing from the hog went to waste, but it also became a treat that people looked forward to at Sunday dinners. Neighbors often traded cracklings after a hog killing, turning the preparation into a social event that celebrated thrift and flavor. Today, store-bought cornbread mixes rarely capture the depth or texture of the old-style Cracklin bread, and few families still render their own pork. For those who have tasted it, the memory of that smoky, savory slice remains a reminder of community resourcefulness and the joy of making something extraordinary from humble ingredients. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than fillies, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Candied yams with brown sugar and butter were the sunshine of the dinner table. They glistened under the oven light, sweet enough to make children hover close and adults sneak a second spoonful. The yams were sliced thick, bathed in melted butter, brown sugar, and a touch of cinnamon, then baked until the edges caramelized and the syrup turned glossy. It was dessert disguised as a side dish, a holiday tradition that showed up even when times were lean. Sweet potatoes were easy to grow, affordable, and rich in comfort, making them a Southern staple long before store-bought sweets came along. Families treated them like a celebration of resourcefulness, how something grown in the ground could taste like grace itself. On Christmas morning or after church on Sunday, that first bite always tasted like home. No matter who made them, the smell was unmistakable, warm, rich, and heavy with memory. For grandparents, this dish was proof that sweetness could still be found in hard times, and for everyone who came after, it became a symbol of continuity. The taste lingered long after the plates were cleared, a quiet reminder that joy, like brown sugar, can rise out of the simplest things. Okra and tomato succotash brought color and heritage together in one bubbling skillet. Fresh okra pods, sliced thin, mingled with sweet, ripe tomatoes, corn kernels, onions, and peppers, creating a medley that linked West African traditions with Native American harvests. The dish simmered until the vegetables melded into a savory stew, thickened naturally by the okra's silken texture. Farmers' markets once overflowed with the ingredients every late summer, and families counted on succotash to stretch their crops and fill their tables. It was a side dish that could stand as a main course when meat was scarce, and its bright flavors paired beautifully with cornbread or rice. Elders told stories of ancestors who carried seeds and memories across oceans and frontiers, weaving history into every spoonful. Though many still grow okra and corn, The slow, careful preparation of true succotash has become rare, replaced by frozen blends and quick sautés that cannot match the patient flavor of the old garden skillet. Mustard greens with salt pork were the kind of dish that spoke to both thrift and tradition. Collard greens were loved, but when money was tight, mustard greens filled the pot just as well, with a sharper bite and a quicker cook. My grandmother simmered them slowly with scraps of salt pork, the fat melting into the broth until every leaf carried flavor. The kitchen smelled earthy, smoky, and strong, reminding everyone that even the humblest greens could feel like a feast when seasoned with care. She always said the broth, what some called potlikker, was the best part, soaking it up with cornbread to make sure not a drop was wasted. It was a dish that brought families together around the table, passing bowls and breaking bread even when meat was scarce. Salt pork was cheap because it was mostly fat, but it gave depth to every bite, transforming greens into comfort. In the 1960s, this was not just a side, it was supper, filling bellies after long days of work. Mustard greens with salt pork carried heritage, thrift, and resilience in one simmering pot. Fried green tomato. Po' boys turned unripe tomatoes into a sandwich that tasted like pure coastal sunshine wrapped in crunchy cornmeal. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until their edges crisped and their centers softened just enough to release a bright tang. Piled high on soft French bread with a smear of remoulade and a handful of shredded lettuce, they became a favorite along Gulf Coast streets where shrimp boats docked and music floated from open windows. Vendors often sold them at fish fries and fairs when seafood prices climbed too high, proving that a garden vegetable could carry the day as well as any oyster or crab. Families remembered the scent of hot oil and the pop of cornmeal batter while waiting in line for a sandwich that blended thrift and celebration. Today, fast food counters try to imitate the flavor, but they cannot capture the quiet magic of fresh garden tomatoes picked before ripening, fried in backyard kitchens, and shared among neighbors who knew the value of every bite. Which recipe reminds you of your grandma's kitchen? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to keep her stories alive.